I found the clown costume hanging in the garment bag where my wedding dress should have been, a red foam nose taped to the mirror, and a note in my mother-in-law's precise handwriting, "Stay in your place." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I stood there in that dressing room, 20 minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, staring at a costume clearly meant to humiliate me in front of 200 guests, and something in me went very, very calm. I put it on. The oversized polka dot ruffles. The rainbow wig. The absurd, honking red nose. I fixed my makeup carefully, walked to the doors of that ballroom, and nodded to the wedding coordinator that I was ready. I walked down that aisle in full clown costume without a single word of explanation, past 200 stunned faces, past my fiancé Marcus standing frozen at the altar, past his mother Deborah, sitting in the front row with an expression caught somewhere between triumph and sudden, dawning horror. Because what Deborah didn't know, watching me walk toward her son in a rainbow wig instead of the dress she'd stolen, was that I'd already discovered something about her 3 weeks earlier. Something significant enough that I'd been quietly waiting for the right moment to use it. She thought she was humiliating me on my wedding day. She had no idea she was about to hand me the perfect stage to do exactly the opposite. My name is Priya Anand, and I was 28 years old, marrying a man I'd loved for 4 years despite his mother's relentless disapproval of me from the very first dinner she'd hosted to get to know me properly. Deborah Kessler had made her feelings clear from that first meeting. A carefully polite but unmistakably cold assessment of everything about me that didn't match whatever image she'd built in her mind for Marcus's future wife. My background wasn't wealthy enough. My career as a museum curator wasn't prestigious enough by her standards. My family didn't belong to the right country club, didn't summer in the right places, didn't fit the particular social tapestry Deborah had spent decades weaving for her only son. Marcus, to his credit, had never once wavered in his commitment to me, though I'd watched him struggle for years trying to navigate his mother's disapproval without fully confronting how deep it actually ran. He'd apologize after her comments, explain away her coldness as just how she is, genuinely believing, I think, that time would eventually soften her resistance to our relationship. It hadn't. If anything, as our wedding date approached, Deborah's subtle undermining had only intensified. Small comments about venue choices, guest lists, even the flowers I'd selected, each one calculated to remind me that in her eyes, I remained fundamentally unworthy of the life she'd envisioned for her son. 3 weeks before the wedding, during what should have been a routine final dress fitting, I'd overheard something entirely by accident. A phone conversation Deborah didn't realize I could hear through a partially closed door, one that revealed information about her that had nothing to do with me at all, but everything to do with exactly why she'd spent years so desperately controlling every aspect of appearances within her family. I'd gone to Deborah's house that day to pick up a family heirloom necklace she'd promised to lend me for the wedding, arriving slightly early, letting myself into the entryway the way I'd learned to do over years of visits, since Deborah rarely answered promptly when she was occupied elsewhere in the house. I heard her voice from her study, tight and urgent, speaking to someone about the Hendrik situation, and keeping this contained before the wedding. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but something in her tone, a genuine panic I'd never once heard from this otherwise perpetually composed woman, made me pause instead of announcing my arrival. "If this gets out before the wedding," she was saying, "it won't just embarrass me. It'll embarrass the entire family, and Marcus deserves better than walking into his marriage with this hanging over us." I couldn't make out every detail of the conversation, but I gathered enough to understand that Deborah was involved in some kind of financial impropriety connected to a charitable foundation she chaired, something involving misappropriated funds and a man named Hendricks who was apparently threatening to go public unless certain demands were met. I quietly retreated before she noticed my presence, my mind racing through what I'd just overheard, understanding immediately that Deborah's relentless focus on appearances, her obsessive control over every detail of our wedding, her constant criticism of my inadequate social standing, existed alongside a significant secret she was desperately trying to contain. I didn't tell Marcus immediately. I wasn't certain enough of what I'd actually heard, and I didn't want to create unnecessary conflict based on a partial conversation I might have misunderstood. Instead, I did something Deborah would never have expected from the daughter-in-law she considered beneath her family's standards. I started quietly researching the Hendricks Foundation, understanding that whatever Deborah was hiding might become significant sooner than either of us expected. What I discovered, over the following 2 weeks of careful research, exceeded even what I'd initially suspected. The Hendricks Foundation, a charity focused on children's arts education that Deborah had chaired for nearly 6 years, had apparently experienced significant financial discrepancies. Funds that appeared to have been redirected toward personal expenses disguised as administrative costs, and outreach programs that public records suggested never actually existed. I found this information through a combination of public tax filings, a local news article from 18 months earlier that had briefly questioned the foundation's spending patterns before quietly disappearing from coverage, and a conversation with my friend Yasmin, who worked in non-profit accounting and helped me understand exactly what the financial records actually indicated. "This looks like a pretty clear pattern of misappropriation," Yasmin told me, reviewing the documents I'd gathered. "If someone reported this formally, your mother-in-law could be facing serious legal consequences, not just embarrassment." I sat with that information carefully, uncertain exactly how or when I might need to use it, understanding that confronting Deborah directly, before the wedding, might simply escalate her hostility toward me without actually protecting myself or Marcus from whatever consequences might eventually surface regardless of my involvement. I decided, ultimately, to simply document everything thoroughly and wait, uncertain what role, if any, this information would play in my life moving forward. I never expected to need it on my actual wedding day. I certainly never expected Deborah's contempt for me to escalate into something as blatant as stealing my dress and replacing it with a clown costume. A message so deliberately cruel that it left no room for misinterpretation about exactly how she felt about my place in her family. But standing in that ballroom doorway in full clown makeup, understanding exactly what I now knew about the woman who just tried to humiliate me in front of 200 guests, I realized her cruelty had just handed me the perfect opportunity to finally use what I discovered. I walked down that aisle slowly, deliberately, letting every guest fully absorb the absurdity of what they were witnessing before I reached the altar where Marcus stood. His face cycling through confusion, horror, and finally, dawning fury as he understood exactly what his mother had done. I stopped in front of him, removed the rainbow wig calmly, and turned to face the entire assembled crowd, my voice steady despite the ridiculous clown makeup still covering my face. "Before we continue," I said, loud enough for the microphone near the altar to carry my voice throughout the ballroom, "I think everyone deserves to understand why I'm dressed like this today." I explained calmly, without visible anger, exactly what I'd found hanging in my dressing room that morning, the note Deborah had left, the deliberate cruelty of replacing my wedding dress with a costume designed specifically to humiliate me in front of everyone who mattered to Marcus and me. Deborah, sitting frozen in the front row, opened her mouth to protest, some explanation clearly forming, but I continued before she could speak. "I've spent 4 years trying to earn this woman's approval," I said, gesturing toward Deborah without breaking my composed tone. "Today, she made it very clear I never will, regardless of what I do. But I think before we move forward with this wedding, everyone here deserves to understand a few other things about the woman who just tried to humiliate me on what should have been the happiest day of my life." I nodded toward Yasmin, seated in the third row, who stepped forward with a small folder we'd prepared together, containing carefully organized copies of the financial documentation I'd gathered over the previous 2 weeks. Deborah's face drained of color as she realized, in real time, exactly what I was about to reveal in front of every person whose opinion had ever mattered to her carefully constructed social standing. I found out 3 weeks ago that Deborah has been misappropriating funds from the Hendricks Foundation, the children's charity she's chaired for 6 years, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the microphone. I wasn't going to say anything today. This isn't the way I wanted to handle it. But I think a woman who would humiliate her son's bride in front of 200 guests has forfeited her right to my silence. The ballroom erupted into hushed, urgent whispers, guests turning toward Deborah with expressions ranging from shock to genuine anger, several of them apparently significant donors to the very foundation I just exposed. Marcus, standing beside me, looked at his mother with an expression I'd never seen him direct at her before, disappointment mixed with something closer to disgust. "Is this true?" he asked her directly, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Deborah, cornered in front of everyone whose respect she'd spent decades cultivating, didn't deny it. She simply sat there, her carefully maintained composure finally, completely shattered, understanding that whatever social standing she'd protected through years of controlling appearances had just collapsed entirely in front of the exact audience she'd always cared most about impressing. "I did this for the family," she finally managed, her voice small in a way I'd never heard from her before. "I didn't want any of this to become public. You tried to humiliate me on my wedding day to protect your own secrets," I said calmly. "I think everyone here can decide for themselves what that says about your priorities." Marcus's father, sitting silently beside Deborah throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke, his voice heavy with resignation rather than surprise. "We'll discuss this properly later, as a family. Right now, I think we should let these two actually get married, if they're both still willing." I looked at Marcus, who nodded immediately, taking my hand despite the ridiculous clown makeup still smeared across my face. We were married 20 minutes later, in front of a crowd that had witnessed something far more significant than either of us had originally planned for that day.